have spent the last several weeks working our way through Exodus 21. Chapter 21 is where we see the beginning of the judgments of Yehovah. Not judgments in the sense of how Yehovah is going to punish his people, but rather judgments in the sense that this is Yehovah's perspective on what keeping the covenant looks like. In other words, it's an expansion or an explanation of the practical application of the 10 words. At the risk of sounding like a broken record, I also need to say again to not be misunderstood by someone that may be hearing this for the first time. It is very clear from the teaching of Exodus 19 that the Torah was given to a redeemed people. In other words, Yehovah's judgments are laid out for a people that have been redeemed. A person does not obtain redemption by keeping the commandments or by keeping the judgments of Yehovah. They are here to help the redeemed know how to live. And so we first took a look at servitude and how being a biblical servant is very different than the slavery that exists in the United States. We also consider the differences of being a Hebrew servant versus a Gentile servant. Last week we considered some scenarios dealing with various physical conflicts between two or more people. It's interesting to consider how much Yehovah values life. It shouldn't surprise us. And how that is reflected in the righteous judgments that are being applied or asked to be applied. Those that take the life of another, which includes permanent disablement, requires the life of the offender. There are exceptions for accidents, but the matter is to be taken before the judges so that all the facts can be weighed. Because if the substance of the accident includes animosity, it is clear there's some form of intent included. We also saw how Scripture provides a provision for the life of an unborn baby. It's not surprising to see that the Torah is pro-life. We also saw how the life of a servant is just as valuable as the life of a free man. It's just as valuable as the life of a woman or a man, so it does not matter gender nor status in life. But an interesting judgment that is laid out is found in verses 24 and verse 25. Let me read that again. It says, for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burning for burning, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. The judgments of Yehovah is about fair and equitable retribution, or restitution in some cases. In other words, after an offense has been done, the judges help determine what the equitable penalty is to restore or compensate for the loss. And we'll see more of this today. But the principle of eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth is a key component to understanding how to apply the Torah in other aspects of life. And why, in reality, the Torah is so short. As I've reflected upon this principle-based idea is way superior than a code book that could possibly be thousands of pages long. And some people may complain and say, why didn't God write page after page after page after page? It'd be so much easier if we had more instructions. Because the reality is, the longer the list is, the more opportunity is for someone to try and argue a loophole or possibly even to miss something. And in reality, a longer list of commandments doesn't really accomplish any more as it relates to obedience. Yehovah's provided this because he knows what man needs to live a righteous life and what truth is needed to understand principles to apply. So we have everything we need. Now, this does not mean all of this is completely straightforward. But what Yehovah has done is provide truth for man to meditate upon. And those that truly desire to live for him will be able to gain the understanding they need to live their life for him. Now, today we're going to finish up chapter 21. We're going to see today, in general, conflicts with animals. Animal versus human, and animal versus animal. Let's go ahead and let's open up in prayer. Heavenly Father, I thank you for the opportunity we have here again to come before you, to continue our journey through learning your judgments. Father, you give us these truths for our benefit, so that we can know how we are designed, how we were created to live, and most importantly, how to serve you. Father, I pray that as we contemplate these truths, Father, I pray that they would challenge us. Pray that we would be open to understanding your word, desiring to dig deeper. And Father, sometimes even as today, We may come across things that we've never even considered before, that we've been influenced by the world, influenced by methodologies, by its wisdom. And Father, sometimes we need to rethink the way that we operate. So Father, I pray that we just be patient with your word and meditate upon it and conform our lives accordingly. I pray that you bless our efforts here today, and I pray all this in Yeshua's name. Amen. So we'll pick it up here today in verse 28. It says in verse 28, if an ox gore a man or a woman, that they die, then the ox shall be surely stoned, and his flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall be quit. Now the text now moves to conflicts with animals. We see here an interaction with an ox. The Hebrew word behind this is the Hebrew word shor, which could mean an ox, a bull, or a steer. It's basically a domesticated animal. So here, this is referring to an ox or an oxen that would have had horns, and if pushed against a man or pushed against a woman, in other words, runs into them with their horns, would easily kill them, unless the person moves out of the way in just the right amount of time. But typically, if any amount of force, a sharp horn piercing into a body will typically do a lot of damage. Now, although this is referring to an ox here, this is not only referred to a certain kind of animal. Remember the principle-based idea here. It could be a horse that kicks a person, or it could be some sort of other animal that causes a death. Here, if an ox gores a person with its horns and kills them, then the consequence is that the animal is put to death by being stoned. And so typically when enough stones are thrown at an animal or a living thing, it eventually shuts down the body because there's so much damage that's caused from it. Now after the animal is put to death, the owner of that animal, the text says, should be quit. The Hebrew word behind the English word quit means to be considered innocent or clean. In other words, the owner does not owe any additional responsibility in the matter. So if the animal has killed a person, the animal is killed, and the owner then is able to move on, and so is anybody else that's connected with this. Now, you might be saying, how is that fair? What if the owner knew there was a problem with the ox? Well, the next verse will deal with that. Now, what is presumed here is that the owner had no basis to know that there would be a problem for a potential issue or harm be caused from his animal. Now, what is being said here is that absent any other known facts, is that the owner gets the benefit of the doubt. Because in reality, the person that gored may have done something wrong themselves, or maybe something happened with the animal that was unpredictable. But again, think about other things that we've learned already. For example, if the owner of the ox was a known enemy of the one that was being gored, for example, well, that might be an additional fact that needs to be taken into consideration. It's like all of a sudden an animal kills a person that happens to be your enemy. And so we need to learn to compare Scripture with Scripture here in applying the principles, and that's what's expected. And so when different facts are involved, it can change the outcome of the judgment that's required. But what is being presented here is a situation where the simple facts are someone was accidentally gored by an ox or by an animal that had horns. In this case, the ox is stoned, and its owner is considered exempt from any additional consequences. So a simple accident has occurred between an animal and a person. Moving on to verse 29 provides the exception that typically someone thinks about. Verse 29 says, but if the ox were wont, which is another word for known, to push with his horn in time past, and it hath been testified to his owner, and he hath not kept him in, that be the ox, but that he hath killed a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and his owner also shall be put to death. So here is a scenario where the owner had knowledge that the ox was known to push or act in an aggressive manner towards a person or to other things in the past, has some sort of demeanor that you know about. In this case, the facts move from simple negligence to failure to act on a knowledge of a problem. So here the owner should have taken precaution to make sure that someone was not hurt by the dangerous animal. That's what's being said here. read the verse here, it says, "But if the ox were wont to push with his horn in time past, and hath been testified to his owner, and he hath not kept him in." In other words, did not put that animal in a situation where it can't harm other people or other animals. So if the owner fails to do that, and the owner knows about this, the owner fails to do so, and the person was killed because of this. Now the owner is personally liable. That's what the verse is saying. And what is the consequence when a person is responsible for taking the life of another? Well, as we've seen earlier in the chapter already, their life is also taken. In other words, because they did not respect the life of another individual, their life is taken in equitable restitution. Now, this lays the basis for understanding that we are guilty of a crime if we willfully fail to act and prevent something we know could likely happen. So again, think about principles based here. If we know something dangerous exists within our control, and we fail to properly contain that danger, and then something bad happens, we're responsible for that. Take the scenario of driving a car, for example. Is it possible to hurt someone while driving a car? The answer is yes. But that doesn't mean that we don't get into a car because there's a possibility we could hurt somebody with that car. That's what it's talking about here, like, for example, with an ox. An ox could be a dangerous animal at all times. But if you know that there's a particular danger with that ox, all of a sudden the facts change. And so you could, for example, get into a car and you could get into an accident, like a true accident as the word implies. But there's a difference between driving a car that is in proper working order or operating a car when you're in proper working order, for example, and one that you know that, for example, the brakes don't work and you get into the car. You are now getting into a known dangerous situation. And if you know your brakes are not working and then you crash into someone and kill them, well, that is different than getting into a true accident that may take the life of another. So you can see here how their application here can become pretty far-reaching in a hurry. It should cause us to think about when we know there's a problem with the situation and we fail to take action when there's danger that very easily could occur because of it. And so the principles presented should be taken seriously here in examining our life. And so this is recognizing that we have responsibility for other individuals that we come in contact with when we have situations that are under control. And so this is related to simple negligence to reasonable knowledge that something could have been prevented. And so there's a difference here between verse 28 and verse 29. Simple negligence at verse 28 versus 29 of knowing a dangerous situation exists and we fail to contain it. But notice that verse 29 contains that the owner of the ox had knowledge of the situation. In other words, if one of the servants knew that the ox had a tendency to push at people, and the servant did not tell the owner, and the owner had no basis to know this, well, then the owner would not be put to death. And so there has to be knowledge of the situation. It's just like, for example, getting into a car that had bad brakes, but you didn't know it had bad brakes. Well, then all of a sudden the responsibility is different versus knowing that there's a brake problem. So maybe you've been hearing the brakes squeak for quite a while. You're hearing grinding. Well, you're now entering into a dangerous situation. Now, before we move on from verses 28 to 29, there's an interesting statement here regarding the dead ox in verse 28. Verse 28 says, "If an ox gore a man or a woman that they die, then the ox shall be surely stoned," or in other words, put to death, "and his flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall be quit." So here's an interesting statement regarding the dead ox itself. It says, "and his flesh shall not be eaten." And so after it's killed, the flesh should not be eaten. Now what is implied is that the dead animal could still be used for other purposes, like using its hide and using its horns. However, the statement that it cannot be eaten is not necessarily an expected statement that you think to see here. And so it's not like there's additional context here. Like, for example, the animal has a disease or something like that. So God is saying you can't eat this because there's something wrong with the animal in the sense that it has something internally bad about it. Like it died of natural causes or some sort of thing happened to it or something like that. The only thing we're told here is that it's been stoned, or it's been, in a sense you could say, injured in a way. In other words, its cause of death is not from slitting its throat. Now, what I've heard some say is that here is a principle that goes into other areas that maybe you don't think about, indicating that an animal that has been wounded before its throat has been slit to release the blood is not to be eaten. In other words, some say that if an animal is shot by like a gun or an arrow, one cannot eat that animal. Now, this is a completely foreign concept to likely every single person in this room. I mean, before I even heard some teaching on this, I never even contemplated this idea. And at first I thought this was actually really weird, a weird connection to make to this verse. However, the more I consider this, the more it has me pausing to think. I think it's important that we do not just brush away some idea or potential understanding as being off or wrong just because we've never considered something before. Now, although this is not the clearest verse here in Exodus 21, there is something said that's even clearer, though, in Leviticus 17 in this regard. So take a look with me to Leviticus 17. So the question before us is it wrong to eat an animal that's been wounded, including been like shot by a gun or an arrow or something like that? So Leviticus 17. We have an interesting statement that appears here in the next book. So Leviticus 17 and verse 13. It says, "And whatsoever man there be of the children of Israel, or of the strangers that sojourn among you, which hunteth and catcheth any beast or fowl that may be eaten, he shall even pour out the blood thereof and cover it with dust." Now, it's very easy just to read over this verse and get the understanding, well, if you kill an animal and the blood is removed like it's supposed to be before you eat it, well, you need to make sure you cover that blood up. And so that's part of the piece of it. But read through very closely here and notice what it says. It says, "which hunteth and catcheth any beast or fowl that may be eaten." And so very easily you see the word hunteth, and you just move on and think of the context that we've been taught today is that hunting means that you track down an animal and you shoot it, or you kill it in some way so that it falls over dead, then you come up to it and then you slit its throat to remove the blood so that you can eat it or harvest it. But notice how it says here, hunteth and catcheth any beast that it may be eaten. So in other words, in order to reach the category to be eaten, you need to hunt it or track it down and catcheth it. Now, in the English, it's not super clear here, but it does refer to the word catcheth, but it says hunteth and catcheth. It does not say hunteth that it may be eaten. It says hunteth and catcheth. So in other words, it has the idea of tracking down the animal and catching it. Now, the Hebrew behind that phrase, hunteth and catcheth it, is literally hunteth, a hunt of the living. Now, it seems kind of redundant there because when you're hunting something, you're obviously hunting something that's alive. But what the Hebrew is saying is you're hunting something to hunt something that's alive, or to keep it alive, is what this is kind of saying. In other words, one is tracking down and capturing a living animal. So it literally says hunting a hunt of a living animal. So that after they capture the animal, the blood is to be poured out and covered up. That's what this is saying. Now you might be thinking, well, what about examples of hunting in the Bible? So first of all, this kind of starts getting you going in a path of saying, well, what does the Bible say? Now there's two people that are specifically called out as hunters, Nimrod and Esau. Now whatever Nimrod did is not applicable because he was an evil individual. So you can't get examples from who he was. But Esau, one could say partly the same, but I think you need to take it a little more seriously because we know that his father Isaac ate what he hunted. And so if we go back to Genesis 25, Genesis 25 in verse 27. So here we have the record of Esau and Jacob. It says in verse 27, the boys grew, and Esau was a cunning or skillful hunter, a man of the field. And Jacob was a plain man, dwelling in tents. So he is compared here to be righteous man or upright. So here we see just the general piece. You can't gather anything from this other than he was a skillful hunter. And so he tracked down animals. That's what this is saying. And again, we take the Western idea, well, this means that he would have gone and went after the animal and shot it somehow, likely with like a bow and arrow or something like that. And when we go a little further on and we move into Genesis 27, we have the end of the life of Jacob when he blesses or looks to bless Esau. And so take a look at verse 1. Let me read the first four verses. And it came to pass that when Isaac was old, and his eyes were dim, so that he could not see, he called Esau his eldest son, and said unto him, My son. And he said unto him, Behold, here am I. And he said, Behold, now I am old, I know not the day of my death. Now therefore take, I pray thee, thy weapons, thy quiver, and thy bow, and go out to the field, and take me some venison, and make me savory meat, such as I love, and bring it to me, that I may eat, that my soul may bless thee before I die. And so we see here that Isaac told Esau to take his weapons, his quiver, and his bow, and get some venison. Now at first, you can look at this and say, well, this seems very straightforward. I mean, it seems like we have an example here of a godly individual, Isaac, clearly requesting for his son to go kill some animal so he can eat it. And what's implied here is this is not the first time. So in other words, Isaac has eaten a number of meals that have been provided from the food that Esau killed. And so you can say, well, here we see that he's instructed to take weapons, and he's supposed to take his quiver and his bow and go get some venison or some animal. And so the idea here is that he took a bow and an arrow. Now, realize, though, it doesn't say he took a bow and arrow. It just says, in the English, it says quiver and bow. Now, the word behind quiver is only found here. And that's what becomes a little bit interesting. You look into something and go, wait a second, is this a right understanding? And I don't want to make this into a gymnastics exercise, but I think it's something for us to pause as we're trying to contemplate, well, is our understanding hunting appropriate? We see this word quiver. It's only found here. And the Hebrew word comes from a word, the verb, that means to hang. And so literally, what Isaac is saying here to his son Esau, go get your weapons, we'll do that word in a minute, and including that thing that hangs. And so the English here, the translators have taken liberty to mean that means quiver. Now the word behind, so this means something that literally hangs. And the word bow, it can mean a bow in the sense of a bow and arrow, but it can also mean something that bends, like a trap, for example. And interestingly, it's connected to the Hebrew word translated as snare in Isaiah 29. So if we go into Isaiah 29. So again, part of this is keeping an open mind and not saying, well, this is how I understand it, this is how it must be. So Isaiah 29, take a look at verse 21. It says here that make a man an offender for a word, and lay a snare for him that reproveth in the gate, and turn aside the just for a thing of naught. And so this word translated as bow is connected to this word translated as snare. And so it starts causing you to pause here a little bit. Well, maybe this is not necessarily an example in Genesis 27 that goes contrary to what is being taught in Exodus 21 and Leviticus 17. And so the word bow, it can mean bow in the sense of a bow or an arrow, but it also means something that bends. And so this word snare here has the idea of laying bait, or almost like a trap type of an idea. And so we go back to Genesis 27 and verse 3. We read that again, Genesis 27 and verse 3. It says, Now therefore take, I pray thee, thy weapons, thy quiver and thy bow, and go out to the field and take me some venison. So we can see here there's some interpretation going on here with the translation. Hopefully you understand that piece of it on the surface. But we also might say, well, wait a second, it says the word weapons here. So a weapon would have to mean like a bow and arrow, or the quiver is applying an arrow here, or a container that's full of arrows. But that word behind weapons just simply means instruments, articles, vessels, apparatus, tools, or gear. So he's basically saying, you could translate this to say, Now therefore take, I pray thee, thy gear, thy hanging thing, and thy thing that bends, or is used to snare, and go out to the field and take me some venison. So weapons can be a valid translation, but Isaac could also be referring to his gear or his instruments that he used to go and hunt for some food. Now at first, I was not going to mention this whole thing, but the more I look into this, I'm starting to rethink this whole idea of hunting for food, at least using a gun or another projectile to kill an animal. Something I know we'll have more conversation about later. So as we go back here to Exodus 21, it's not a far stretch. And maybe you've heard even like within Jews, in order for them to eat an animal, they only eat animals that have their throats slit. Well, why is that? Well, they don't view hunting as right. By the way, they also view hunting for sport as being purely unethical, because why would you want to just go hurt an animal that hasn't done anything wrong? And so it kind of calls it in mind a little bit of what we do generally within our society is more connected to Nimrod than necessarily a biblical principle. And we read our Western ideas into the Bible. And so it's something to think about here. I think seriously about. Because when you look at Exodus 21, our passage, and you go back to verse 28, Exodus 21 verse 28, it says, if an ox gore a man or a woman that they die, then the ox shall be surely stoned, and his flesh shall not be eaten. Well, why is that? Well, the word doesn't always give us the exact answers for why we do things or why we're instructed for things. But here, connected to if there's a wound of some sort, it's consistent with Leviticus 17 that there needs to be a hunt and a catch, and not a hunt and a kill and then slit the throat. So something to consider here. Moving on in Exodus 21, verse 30. It says that there be laid on him a sum of money, then he shall give for the ransom of his life whatsoever is laid upon him. Now this verse itself seems a little bit odd and hard to understand. And so this verse, though, needs to be read in the context of verse 29. So let's go back to verse 29. But if the ox were wont or known to be put to push with his horn in time past, and have been testified to his owner, and he hath not kept him in, but that he hath killed a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and his owner shall be put to death. And so here, it says now in verse 30, if there be laid on him, that be the owner, that is destined to be put to death, a sum of money, then he shall give for the ransom of his life, whose life? The life of the owner that is supposed to be put to death, whatsoever is laid upon him. So what this is saying is that if a person that was killed by the ox that pushed him, according to verse 29, if the owner should have known better, then the owner is to be put to death as a punishment for failing to take the necessary precautions with a known bad ox. However, a reasonable scenario might be, or a scenario may come up, that what if the person that died from the ox had a wife or had a family? Or others that depend upon him to provide for them. Like I said, maybe a wife, maybe a family. Now, what good is it going to do for that wife or that family or others that rely upon that person for the owner to be put to death? To them, they would rather receive some sort of monetary provision or compensation to help them survive. And that's what's being brought up here. It's saying that a ransom price can be named if that is a better solution to the harm that is caused. The righteous response is the man is to be put to death because he didn't regard life. However, that may not be the best answer in the situation, and so Yehovah provides an alternative solution. Now, we're not told who determines the amount, but it likely would involve judges. And once the price is set, the owner has the ability to pay the ransom in exchange for his life. So in today's terms, I don't know, maybe that's like $1 million or something like that. And so the person says, well, your life can be spared if you'll give us $1 million. Now, they have an interest here of making it a reasonable amount, right? Because if they set it too high, well, they're going to get nothing, right? So, but the idea here is that the life of the owner can be spared if a ransom is paid. And so this is an interesting judgment because it tells us that Yehovah is not about destroying lives. Because in the scenario where the one killed has a family, not only would that result in an additional death because the owner would be put to death, right, of the ox, but a whole family could be put into poverty because of it. As Yehovah is saying, here's an alternative if this makes sense. But here this whole scenario is based on the contingency of, as it says here in the beginning of verse 30, if there be laid on him a sum of money. In other words, it's not the owner that creates a scenario that or even can demand it. So it's not like the owner says, wait. Let me see if I can buy my way out of this thing. That's not what's being said here. Rather, it's the family saying, wait, we think we'd rather choose to go this route. Or somebody else that has influence in the situation connected to that person that died. And so, in other words, it has to be laid upon him. He doesn't dictate the terms. He doesn't dictate the scenario. This happens because it is laid upon him. So here we see an interesting situation that can arise from this. So ultimately, death is not the ultimate result if there is a more reasonable alternative that should be put into place. So that's verse 30. Although the wording there seems a little bit awkward to us initially, it's connected to the previous verse. Verse 31 says, whether he hath gored a son or hath gored a daughter, according to this judgment shall it be done unto him. So we receive additional clarification here that the same judgment applies to a son or a daughter. Now back in verse 29, we saw that judgment applies equally to a man or a woman. So go back to verse 29. But if the ox were wont to push with his horn in times past, and had been testified to his owner, and he had not kept him in, but he had killed a man or a woman. So what's implied here is an adult, a male or a female. It doesn't matter, the same judgment applies. We get to verse 31, and we find it doesn't matter if it's an adult or a child. We see here a son or a daughter. And so it does not matter gender, and it does not matter age. So it doesn't matter who the ox kills. It's the same consequences. Yehovah values the life no matter what. Now moving on to verse 32. It says, if the ox shall push a manservant or a maidservant, he shall give unto their master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. Now here we see if a servant is the one that is killed. Well, then the owner of the ox needs to give the owner of the servant 30 shekels of silver. And in addition to this, the ox still needs to be stoned or killed. Now, we're not giving all the words here, but it seems that this is going in contrast to the verse that we just read in verse 30, where it says, if there be laid on him a sum of money. In other words, here, if there's a servant involved, well, the same kind of principles are involved, but there can be 30 shekels of silver that is paid as a consequence, as a way of ransom. Or it would seem from the other truths that are provided here, the other judgments still apply. And so this might be additional compensation, or it could be related to as an alternative for a ransom to be paid. Now, I think part of what's being implied here is the servant from the one master was being used by the other master, and this ends up being compensation for that. Now, I want to take a little bit of a rabbit trail here as well on this verse. I think it's interesting because this tells us the value of a servant. And what's the value of a servant, according to this verse? 30 shekels, 30 shekels of silver. Now this is different than the value for a free man. So let's take a look at Leviticus 27 where we see that laid out. Leviticus 27. I have a reason for doing this. Leviticus 27, let's read starting in verse 1. We see the values for men and for women. And what's implied here is that these are for free individuals or not servants. Verse 1, it says, The Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When a man shall make a singular vow, the person shall be for the Lord by thy estimation. And thy estimation shall be of the male 20 years old, and even unto 60 years old, even thy estimation shall be 50 shekels of silver out of the shekel of the sanctuary. And so what this idea is that if a person vows their life to God and makes a promise of some sort, well, the value they need to pay that equates to the value of their life here, if they're 20 years old or older and they're a man, is 50 shekels of silver. To redeem their life, that's what they have to pay. Verse 4. And if it be for a female, then thy estimation shall be 30 shekels. And if it be from 5 years old, even unto 20 years old, then thy estimation shall be of the male 20 shekels, and for the female 10 shekels. And so here we can see that if a person is 20 to 60 years old, it's 50 shekels. If it's a female, it's 30. If the person is, as it says here, from 5 years old to 20, well, then if it's a male, it is 20 shekels, and for a female, 10. Verse 6. And if it be from a month old, even unto 5 years old, then the estimation shall be of the male 5 shekels of silver, and for the female, the estimation shall be 3 shekels of silver. So if a person is a 1 month old all the way to up to 5, so 1 month old to 5, well, there's 5 shekels for the male and 3 for the female. Verse 7. And if it be from 60 years old and above, if it be a male, then thy estimation shall be 15 shekels, for the female 10 shekels. All right, so here we can see that the estimation or the value for a person who's 60 years old and older is 15 for a male or 10 for a female. So why don't we just go through all that? Well, in summary, just focusing on the male side of things. So a male from 1 month old to 5 is 5 shekels. From 5 to 20 is 20 shekels. From 20 to 60 is 50 shekels, and 60 plus is 15 shekels for a male. And we see this principle for Joseph when he was sold. So for example, go back to Genesis 37. Genesis 37. Taking a look at verse 28. Genesis 37 and verse 28. We know most of the context here, so I don't think I need to read it. Genesis 37 verse 28 says, Then there passed by Midianites, merchantmen, and they drew and lifted up Joseph out of the pit, and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph into Egypt. Now, we see here Joseph was sold for 20 shekels. Well, why was he sold for 20 shekels? Who can tell me why? How old he was. How old was Joseph during this time? Anybody remember? 17 years old. Very good. And so if a person was from the ages of 5 to 20, the value of the person was 20 shekels. So Joseph fits that pattern. So Joseph, though, we also know from our time back here in Genesis, was a prefigurement for who? For the Messiah. And for when the Messiah, when he was sold. How much was Messiah sold for? 30. So we turn to Matthew chapter 27. Matthew 27. Taking a look at verse 9. Matthew 27 verse 9. Matthew 27, verse 9, it says, Then was fulfilled that which was spoken by Jeremy the prophet, saying, And they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of him that was valued, whom they of the children of Israel did value. See, here we find that he was sold for 30 pieces of silver. Now, it's very clear here as well, this is fulfillment of prophecy. We see here as spoken of Jeremiah. We do know that there is written and prophesied in the book of Zechariah that he'd be sold for 30 pieces. But we don't have any other connections to the value of 30, at least when we go back to Leviticus 27. However, when we consider how Joseph was a prefigurement of the Messiah and he was sold for his correct value, how could it be said that the Messiah was sold for his correct value? Because he wasn't sold for 20 shekels of silver. Some people want to say, well, the Messiah was worth more than Joseph. Well, okay, not really. That wasn't what the point of this being made. But how old was Yeshua when he died? 33. So according to Leviticus 27, what should his value have been? No. If you were from 1 month to 5, it was 5 shekels. 5 to 20 was 20 shekels. From 20 to 60 was 50 shekels. And 60 and above was 15. So how much should he have? 50. But he wasn't. He was only paid for 30. So does that mean that he was shortchanged? Well, the answer is no. Because the prophecy is not connected to Leviticus 27, which is the value of a free man. Because Yeshua did not come as a free man. What did he come as? A servant. And what's the value of a servant? 30 shekels, according to what? Exodus 21. You see the connection there? So I think it's kind of an interesting thing to be seen. So that's what takes us back to Exodus 21. Now, verse 32 that we just read, let me read that again. It says, And if an ox shall push a manservant or a maidservant, he shall give unto their master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox should be stoned. So in other words, this is the value of a servant. 30 shekels of silver. So you can see how both Yeshua and Joseph were accurately priced according to Scripture. Now, what's very interesting here in verse 32 is that the verse is also referencing an ox or a shore, which is an animal specifically connected to a messianic promise in Deuteronomy 33. Now, we're not going to go there, but this is something we're going to talk about as Sukkot this year, and how the shore or the ox is connected to a messianic promise. So we'll deal with that later. So it's interesting. We see here in Exodus 21, in verse 32, we have a connection of the value of the Messiah and the connection to the ox. So it's very interesting. Verse 33, moving on. So a few little things there which I think just help connect some scriptures. Verse 33, And if a man shall open a pit, or if a man shall dig a pit, and not cover it, and an ox or an ass fall therein, well, verse 34 says, The owner of the pit shall make it good, and give money unto the owner of them, and the dead beast shall be his. Thank you very much, sure he says. Here we find another scenario of willful disregard for not properly dealing with a dangerous situation. So just like the ox that was known to push, and an owner that had this information fails to keep him under lock or out of a dangerous situation. Here we find a man that opens a pit or digs a huge hole and fails to cover it. An ox or an ass, or in other words, some other animal falls in, well, and dies. We see here that the owner has responsibility. So in this case, an uncovered pit. He leaves the pit that he dug without covering it. Now, if someone's animal falls into the pit and dies, it's not considered a simple accident. Like, in other words, the animal just should have known better. It's something that should have been prevented. And because of this, the man that left his pit uncovered has to pay the owner of the dead animal the fair price related to the animal. So notice as it says here in verse 34, it says, The owner of the pit shall make it good and give money unto the owner of them. How much money? It doesn't say. Why? Well, because it varies based on the animal, because as it says here, it could be related to an ox, it could relate to a donkey, it could relate to another animal. But he needs to make it good. But in exchange, the owner of the pit gets the dead animal. So in other words, it's fair resolution for the situation that unfolded. So in essence, the man that lost his animal receives the full value from the animal and is no worse off. So if your animal was out there and it fell into the pit and died, well, you get compensation for that. And so you go buy another animal if you want to, or use the money for something else. But the man that failed to cover the pit basically paid for a dead animal at the price for a live animal. So he does not go away empty-handed because he bought something. He bought a dead animal, though, because of his willful negligence to deal with the situation, to prevent something. But he receives essentially what his foolishness bought him. Maybe he didn't want to buy anything, but he forced this situation to happen. So again, we see that people are held accountable for not properly taking a reasonable precaution that can prevent tragedies. And when tragedy happens, they are responsible. Notice that Yehovah does not have people going around assessing fines for leaving pits uncovered. It's kind of an interesting concept to think about a little bit. What is our situation that can exist within our world? We have people going around checking the box, make sure, are you doing what you're supposed to be? And if you don't, you have to pay a fine for it. That's not how it works in the Bible. It's kind of interesting. You don't pay a fine for doing something that could have caused a problem, but doesn't cause a problem. Rather, a consequence is laid or put upon you if you did something you should have known better for and it does cause a problem. It's kind of an interesting way of thinking about it. And so we see here there's no penalty unless an actual harm is done. And here it has to do with an uncovered pit. So the penalty is not assessed unless the harm is actually caused. It's like Yehovah's judgment is, you can choose to be stupid if you want to. But if you choose that route to being stupid and someone gets hurt, then you pay the consequence. So it's kind of interesting philosophy. Very different than how we operate in society. You can choose to be stupid if you want to, but you have consequences if something happens. Verse 35. Next verse. And if one man's ox hurt another's, that he die, that'd be the other ox, then they shall sell the live ox and divide the money of it, and the dead ox also they shall divide. Now this is one that you may not think initially, but this makes a lot of sense. See, here we have another animal scenario. In this case, it's animal versus animal. The previous ones has been animal versus person for the most part. One man's ox hurts another man's ox so that the ox that is hurt dies. In this case, the resolution is that the living ox is sold. And what is typically implied by this is sold for the slaughter. And then that money is divided up between the two men. Also, the dead animal is also divided up between the two men. The result is that both men come out equal. Neither one is better off than the other. Now, you might say, well, wait a second. I just got half a good animal and half a bad animal. How am I, if I just lost my animal, better off? And I used to have, or the other person, I had a good animal, now I've got one and a half, now I've got basically 3/4, if you look at it that way. And so what is implied here in this verse is that neither individual is at fault. The man that owned the ox that gored the other ox, and the man that had the ox that was killed. Neither man is at fault. The reality is that it could have been an issue with the ox that hurt the other. So in other words, it could have been a matter of the ox that was the aggressor was the problematic ox. That could be the case. Or the ox that got hurt might have done something that bother or frustrate the ox that did the damage. Maybe it got in the way. Maybe it stepped on his foot or whatever. Who knows what happened, right? Something odd could have happened that caused the other animal to charge at it or something. The reality is that an animal can sometimes be unpredictable, especially ones that are acting in unfamiliar situations. So again, there is not an assessment of what really happened and that there were witnesses to discern proper judgment. The outcome here is that both men are restored to the best way that is possible. However, what if the ox that caused the harm was a known troublemaker? And that's what we have in the next verse 36. Or if it be known that the ox hath used to push in times past, and his owner hath not kept him in, he shall surely pay ox for ox, and the dead shall be his own. And so here, just like an owner who knows his ox is known to be pushed in the previous examples, if that ox kills a human, then the owner is liable for the death. So here we have the same thing, though, applied to an animal versus animal situation. If the owner knew that his ox was a troublemaker and had pushed other animals in the past, well, then that owner should have not allowed his animal to be with another person's animal. That's what it's trying to say here. But when that did happen, and another animal dies, and the owner should have been able to prevent it, well, then the owner is responsible for that death. However, the owner of the ox is not killed. So just because my ox may have killed your ox, and I knew my ox was a bad ox, I'm not put to death. Why? Because it's an animal that's killed. It's not another person that's killed. It's not equal retribution to say because an animal was killed, my life needs to be taken. Because God does not value the life of an animal the same way he values the life of a person. So if you see that here. A person wasn't killed. It was just an ox. So this may offend PETA, for example, because they would value the life of an animal above the life of a person, because we are supposed to serve the creation more than the creator. All right, but in this case, here the owner of the dead ox receives the living ox. That's the compensation. So if your ox were killed because of my ox, well, then I have to give you my dead ox. I have to give you my living ox that caused the damage. And the owner of the ox that pushed receives the dead ox. So in that case there, if my ox killed your ox, well, I get the dead ox. What is implied is that the owner that had his oxen killed can now either use this living ox for his purposes, carefully, right? Because he has an ox that's known to push, or he can sell it, is the idea. But he can't just give it to another person, and not give a warning about it. But in both verses 35 and 36, what is generally understood is that if the ox that was known to push is to be sold, like in verse 35, is that it would be sold for slaughter. You wouldn't sell it to someone else and say, well, buyer beware, type of a thing. You would sell it to be sold because it's a dangerous animal. And then that is the money that would be divided up in verse 35. And so here, living ox that is given to a person that had a dead ox, if they were to sell it, they would sell it for slaughter, is the idea. Because it would not be right to sell an animal that is known to push or harm other animals. So here we come to a conclusion of Exodus 21. So we see with a number of conflicts, we see a number of solutions with servants and how they're supposed to be treated, and we see here conflicts man between man and animal and man as well. So next week we'll continue in Exodus 22, where we'll see more judgments listed. So hopefully you're finding this interesting. So seeing some new things that are challenging, clarifications that maybe didn't understand in the past, but there's a lot of good stuff here. So, and how we can live our life to be righteous in God's eyes. Let's go ahead and let's pray. Heavenly Father.